Hello and welcome to Mutually Short Conversation. I am here with Michelle Garner, otherwise known as one half of OG Rose. Michelle, what have you guys been working on recently? What are your like main ongoing projects before we start?
Oh golly. Well, we of course have the Belonging Again project, which is still ongoing. We will have subsequent releasings on, part two. So that's very exciting. Be on the lookout for that. It was really great to be able to have a conversation in our home with you about Belonging Again part one. So there's that. I feel as though I recently have been delving a little bit more into some of the can I mean, my thing, I always do like to go back to the body itself. So I'm reading John Paul II on the body right now. And also thinking about it, like I'm also taking some time to learn a little bit more of some of the kind of the Lacanian structures of things and the worldview that you can kind of glean from that psychoanalytic tradition. So there's that. But, of course, just the regular projects of, raising the children, the farm. Spring is springing over here. So we're going to start the garden soon, but I've already started little planters inside the house. Very excited. Like every day we all look at the little planters and see if anything has sprouted. It's very exciting. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question. I also have my little poetry things I do here and again in the background. Me and Sam, greener side of Sam, are like doing some little quiet project together. So I'm not going to say much more on that until it's public. But yes, so I hope that answers your question.
Great. No, all the links will be below. I think people should go check you out, but not only watch your stuff, but actually read the books because people don't do that all the time.
Thank you.
Anyway, we're going to talk generations. Want to play the generation game?
Woohoo! Let's do it. I'm glad.
Okay, this is really mean. This is really putting you on the spot because I know you're not sort of a you're not someone who wants to like curtly write off a generation. I don't think. I think that's to your credit. But I'm going to say a generation, and you're going to give me one word that immediately comes to your mind.
Oh gosh.
The one word, the first word that you get. Okay, it's quick fire. You ready?
Wait, okay. I'm ready. Oh gosh, I feel put on the gun. Okay, go ahead.
Baby boomers.
Genitals.
Wait, what? Did you say the G word?
Yes, I did.
Okay, sorry, we'll move on. Okay, Gen X.
Weird words.
One word. You get one word.
I get what? I suck at this, Barnes.
Okay, that is weird. Okay. Okay, we're moving on. Gen Y. Oh, sorry, millennials. Sorry, that's millennials.
Millennials?
That's millennials. Gen Y.
Okay.
One word.
CDs.
CVs. Okay, Zoomers. Gen Z.
Baggy pants.
That's 2 words, my dude.
Sorry, I'm not good at this. I don't follow along with like the terms for generations. Like I could talk about it more broadly, but knowing like the super duper stereotypical tropes of those.
Gen Alpha. Gen Alpha. Gen Alpha.
Gen Alpha. iPads.
Yeah, you've got it. You've got some Gen Alphas going on. Come on, you should know all about. Yeah. Okay, iPads. At least that's one word. That was really mean because I've got my words, but I had a time to think about it, so that was a bit mean.
Yeah.
Okay, so I got selfish for boomers.
Okay.
Gen X irresponsible. Gen Y or millennials sensitive. Zoomers cringe. Alphas ignorant.
Just had to highlight all of their vices, didn't you?
Well, this is the weird thing about the generation discourse because I, especially on Schizo FM, when me and Owen get into it a little bit, we're always just roasting boomers. Like we're roasting boomers and Gen X as well. I think we say boomers, we don't. I at least use it this way: is that when we say boomers, it's usually like people have the mindset of boomers rather than the post-war to like mid-60s sort of actual cohort. I usually say like you have that boomer mindset. I think that extends into my parents' generation, which is like more Gen X. And I think this is the problem. The discourse is people often like I don't know, like I've had like friends and stuff who I've said, "Oh, you're such a boomer." Like, but he's like, "I was born in like this year," but he's like, "You don't understand. Like, being a boomer or being a Zoomer is a mindset. It's not actually like the cohort in the
Mm.
discourse. I don't think." But yes, you're right. Like, this is why I kind of wanted to be as negative as I could in my single words, is because everyone always views them through the negative lens for some
Yeah.
reason, and I'm not sure why that is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Isn't it always just like human nature to sort of look at like some other time period or other group or like the older people or the really younger people and kind of just describe like they're kind of stupid or they don't know what they're talking about or they're kind of like it's a sort of human nature to do that where it's sort of and I don't know, maybe like I feel like from your perspective though there's a self-skepticism all the way down, so it's not just like we're not just gonna look at everybody else and sort of we'll critique our own generation as well like very clearly, very starkly. But I don't know, I think I wonder if there is just the tendency of humans to and this is where this is gonna, I don't mean to open a can of worms, but I do feel like people tend to do that. Like we just tend to focus on the negative. And there's a lot of like languaging about, oh, we need to focus more on like negativity. And I know that people sort of mean that more on sort of an ontological level or whatever, or maybe even in the Hegelian sense. But I don't know. As humans, we tend to just sort of focus on like what we don't like or what that problematic thing is. And there's a balance of yeah, you don't want to be like, naive and just only like have the wool over your eyes and not see the reality of certain mindsets or whatever. You need to be able to look at them clearly and see what are the vices there, but what also could potentially be the virtues there. Like obviously, people who think that a certain way do it for a reason. They think there's something that is true about what they think or whatever. So I don't know. I think it's funny to me sometimes where this idea of like, oh, we're not being like negative enough. I get that, but it's also like people tend to just be can be negative in the sense of like let's focus on the downside instead of sort of acknowledging the bothness. Like it's not necessarily just both, but I think there's a bothness to every particular type of mindset. So including and considering both can be helpful. I think too, like I don't know if I'm just have become a bit more of like a hobbit or something like that, but I don't tend to, I guess I'm maybe I feel a little bit removed from even understanding more fully what those mindsets are. Like I'm kind of thinking to myself, you did a great job with like the encapsulation in one word for each, but I'm wondering like you said something about how your friend or somebody you were talking to said like it's more like a mindset, it's not necessarily just that actual demographic group or like the age group. So for example, like with boomers, what would you typically say gets associated? Like if you make that kind of joking insult to somebody like, oh, you're such a boomer, what is that going to kind of imply for them? And this is just, I mean, maybe I'm just live under a rock, but like I know to a degree, but I don't know, maybe that's just something that I have paid less attention to, or it has been less gripping for me to think about schematically. So yeah, what would you say, Samuel?
No, I think it's very clear that, and this is to your benefit. I think I spend a lot more time on the toxic internet than you do. I know that for a fact. Like I know you well enough to be like, oh, like Michelle doesn't want to look at the horrible stuff that poisons your soul. But, like, I don't know. Like it's weird because like in a joking way, the whole calling someone a boomer thing basically means like I don't know, they're struggling to use a computer or something like this,
Right.
right?
Okay. That's yeah.
But that's
Or
the
they
jokey
like they
way.
look at a meme and they're like, "Oh, do you know that person?" Right? Like, or who's that? And you're like,
Sure.
"It's just a meme, mom. It's just a meme."
Yeah, but there's the more politicized way where, um, yeah, it comes back to you know boomers being around. It actually, the meme that you probably know that it's closest to is that good times create weak men, because after the Second World War, there was no immediate enemy for a bit, and actually, when there was an enemy, it was deterred by the way technology had gone at that point, basically, and basically, boomers had the most prosperity, they had the safest um like time in like international security, or probably in all of human history, and it's also the first generation with television as well, and they're also I think the reason why it feels oppressive to every single generation that came afterwards, and I guess this is probably why it bleeds into Gen X a little bit, is those two cohorts were like numerically speaking, because there's a reason why they're called baby boomers, right? Like they're the largest cohort, and also because of the economic prosperity, have the most economic leverage, and also have the most cultural influence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very interesting. And I think on like the right, so the more whether it's conservatism, even in like the base Trumpist sense, but even like to people who are more reactionary, they see them as the movers and shakers who have created the situation of the current time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's the political side of it, I think, and this actually it extends into the leftist side of things, where they are going against the boomers because they don't think the system of competition was fair because they're not set up with the same advantages that boomers had, basically, and they want to redistribute along those lines. So those are as simplified as I can, like the two political angles of it, I would say.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That was very informative and illuminating.
But it's also, I think I am coming out from an American context, because it is different in Europe, because obviously, like we weren't, for example, America boomers were doing pretty hot in like 1946, but Europe wasn't looking so great, you know? So it is slightly different from a European context. Like, for example, coming from my people, like Britain had food rationing for a couple decades after the Second World War, and we had food rationing for, I think it was either 5 or 10 years, but it was after the Soviet Union had ended rationing. So it's slightly different from that context, but I think maybe if we stick to the American context, it might be.
Yeah. You know the meme you said, like, what was it? Good vibes make bad manners.
Good vibes. No, it's
Sorry.
It's the Roman Empire one. So it's the one that shows the decline of the Roman Empire, right? So it's hard times create strong men create good times, and good times create weak men. Something like that. I don't know. I think that's it, right? And so it's used for like the Roman Empire, but it's also used for like the boomers, and then coming to us, and now we're the I don't know. I guess we're the weak men.
I feel like a boomer trying to talk about anything related to meme culture. Like, what is that? I'm using the.
I feel like a boomer having to explain it to my grandma.
Oh my gosh.
Anyone who's listening and thinks I'm mean, this is just how we communicate, guys.
Yeah, we're good.
This is how I always speak to Michelle.
I love
I'm curious. It's not very nice to ask a woman's age, but I'm either the oldest Zoomer or the youngest millennial. I think I'm closest to the youngest millennial. It depends on who you ask, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I'm
sensitive and cringe.
Yeah. I mean, being like, so for me, like, I was born in 1989, so it was on that, like, I was just actually thinking last night I was talking to Haven, because he was asking me about like what was like the millennial scare, like Y2K, like, I don't know if you remember that. And so I was like, we were talking about this, and how, this is really really was pre-internet, in the sense that, all of the fact that the dates were going to change from 1999 to 2000, the 2 zeros could have potentially messed up all of the computing, and like all of the sort of all of the things that went into like the computer systems and all of that. And so he was just sort of asking, like, but what's the big deal? Like, the date changes, it's just like another year. And so we were kind of getting into talking about that. But yeah, it I think there's something about like how much has changed. Like, I do feel as though, I don't know, maybe my parents though really have seen the most. Like they've seen, from basically like not having television, like you mentioned. And I'm really glad you brought up the television, because you also wrote about this in was it part 1 of your Promethean Fire? I love that so much, on your Substack. And you had talked about like the hearth being usually the kind of the centralizing factor of the home, but then it became in many ways the television, and but anyways, I think about my parents' generation and how much they've seen and how much has changed. And just to speak to that idea of like, it's unfair because the boomers they set up things the way it is now, but they had certain advantages we don't have today. And I think that's true, but again, maybe I'm just like too much of a half, a glass half full type of gal. But it's like there's also huge advantages we have today that they didn't have. I mean, yes, the internet can be like this horrible soul sucking place of like horror and kind of rabbit holes, but it can also be like the fact that the reason why we're able to speak today. There's a lot of potential. Like I can go and create some sort of like little business if I want to suddenly because of the internet, and have like the world basically at my access for that. And so we've got all these new potentials today that boomers didn't have. Now, yes, they may have created a type of structure and system that's like in a way very hard to satisfy or like conform to, but they still hold that expectation thinking it's still like the era they grew up in, and it's not. So yeah, I understand how that can feel very unfair and create a lot of like unnecessary sort of tension familially and stuff like this. But in a way, you maybe just have to accept that there were pros and cons for them, there's pros and cons for us too. And instead of sort of kind of play a constant comparison game, so just like try your best to sort of live in what is the situation, because we can talk all day long about why it is this way, or how it that might feel unfair, and in a sense, and in some senses life isn't fair, but it is how it is. So then what do we do with it now? But yeah, I do think like my parents' generation saw such change technologically speaking, and it's just radical to me that like my father started out growing up, I don't even know if they had a radio in their home, and now he's able to have like an iPhone and WhatsApp call his sisters or siblings and in South Africa, things like that. So, I mean, we saw, I mean, in a way, like, because I was going to initially say that our generation has experienced the most or seen the most sort of change technologically, but I don't know. Maybe our parents have, and that could be both like, well, great, they get to have like, the best of both worlds. They had like that antiquated, nice sort of like life pre-internet. But now they have this sort of whole world of internet now. But that also can be a huge shock to the system of like, whoa, things have changed so much, and they might feel like, I don't know. I mean, I don't think a lot, like, I want to say on the whole, usually people try to see the best in technology, like, especially when they're on the level of just using it to sort of communicate with their family and, do their emails and stuff like that. They use it for that instead of kind of getting into the, like, the weeds and the sort of the potential muck of like internet life. And if you just dwell there a little too long and have no purpose, and then you just kind of get caught up in a lot of different things. So yeah, I don't know if it's just maybe that balance. Like, yeah, that is one advantage then, maybe being able to say like, we always use technologies for certain purposes, so we're going to carry that mindset into the future and use our certain new technologies for these purposes. Whereas like the younger generations that engage with it have maybe lost touch with like having a purpose for these technologies. Like you don't, you didn't grow up necessarily knowing like, oh, I use this axe to chop my wood, or I use whatever it is. Just think of something very like practical. I use this axe to chop this wood to put into our wood stove to have our hearth, so that we can actually heat up our kettle and sit by the fire and be warm. It's like you've lost touch with all of that. So then this element of like, what is the actual purpose of this, and the directionality, and my own functionality in this and relationship to that is lost. It's just completely lost. So then the engagement with these newer technologies becomes a little bit more, I would say it's like a little bit of more, what's the word? Precarious, I guess. Precarious and dangerous too. Not that danger is always bad necessarily. I do think that like some of the best things are dangerous, but there's also like just kind of danger that is thoughtless, which then is just stupidity potentially. So I don't know, that was a lot, but those are some of the things that that came to mind. I would love to circle back at some point to the TV and hearth distinction, but yeah, what does that make you think, Samuel?
Yeah, I've got a lot to say about hearts and TVs. Don't worry about that. I'm going to kind of a cliche. I don't know. This is really cliche, but I think it's true. Humans, for better or for worse, like we have constant rose-tinted glasses on for our neighbor, for different time periods, for different cultures. Because for us, the grass is always greener. We see this way because I like to think in a positive way, because we're striving animals and we like to make things better. We're thinking, oh, this could always be better, right? But just to give like a bit of context, like for example, I struggled with this during COVID, like feeling really resentful about, oh, I'm locked in my room and I can't do anything and all this sort of stuff. But people have gone through this stuff before. Like people have gone through the Black Death, and you're even like in an even harder authoritarian way, people would lock you in your house to your likely death. And this happened again after the First World War with the Spanish flu, which most people don't know. This comes back to the rose tinted goggles thing. Is most people think the World War One was a horrible and was a horrible thing that killed like so many people, more than anything ever, which is true. But the Spanish flu outbreak after the war, because of the condition Europe was in and the the death rate of the Spanish flu and how fast it spread, that outbreak killed more people than the actual conflict itself. And people don't realize this, and people, and it affected all sorts of people, and people were like trapped in their houses, or they would stay trapped in their houses to avoid these things. Now, what happened, for better or for worse, with COVID was a horrible thing, yes. But in a sense, thank God we have technologies like Zoom and video calls and these sorts of things. Like, thank God we weren't in 1920 and you've got a bookshelf, right, of books, but once they're done, what do you do then? Like, at least we've got connection to the internet and like instant media of anything we want. And again, this all comes down to how you use these things, because you can use that power of instant media to have really meaningful conversations, to connect with your family members, to on YouTube you can watch lectures from a Yale or Harvard professor for free on like Milton. Imagine you could just have that at the click of your fingers in 1920. You'd be, it's just magical, right? But this technology also gives us ubiquitous pornography, which is destroying marriages and is, just destroying all the positive libido of our society, and is, cheapening any relationships that people have as well. So it's all about context, and it comes, I think, again, there's some issues. People have a lot of issues with Viktor Frankl, but I think that logotherapy has a very useful message about human meaning, which is that the real challenge of being human is not working out how to manipulate your current time period, or how to manipulate your current generation, or people around you into the best outcome right now. But the real challenge of being human is figuring out how to live, like, metaphysically, how to live the best way as a human across different time periods. Like, to be a person of character is to be a good person who can live as meaningful a life as possible, no matter what time period and what situation you're dropped into. Like, people, to give an example, right? Like, there would, in the boomer time, there would have been good boomers and bad boomers. And good boomer, like, if they were dropped in today, they would make the most of it, right? Mm-hmm. But a bad boomer, okay, they might like be really rich and all this sort of stuff and have safety and be able to have a big house really easily. But drop them in any other time period, or maybe later on, decades down the line, their marriage fell apart or something like this. That's the real challenge of being human. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's absolutely true. And yeah, no, I think Viktor Frankl's work is really important as well. And I mean, I think too, that's where, I said earlier, this idea of like you don't be completely naive or uninformed about different generations and what kind of made and shaped generations to be what they are. But there's also the idea of just the comparison. What do they say? Comparison is the thief of joy or something, right? There's that sort of expression. And I do think that there is something very, very true to that. Like, I can even just attest to it. Like, I remember first moving out to the country, and I would always just kind of like compare, I miss, the just all of the hubbub and the people of the city I'd lived in previously, and I just wonder, like, I don't know, I sort of miss that energy. And then I remember my friend, Elizabeth, she said to me something like, for whatever reason, this really struck my heart, and to reconsider my constant comparison and thinking about this. I mean, I guess it was also a comparison of like no longer living with my identical twin sister and all of these things. So it was a bigger factors than just simply the geographical, like, locational change. But I remember the sense of it, like, that loneliness that comes in being like, kind of more what feels to be like kind of dropped in the middle of the country sort of feeling, and country as in like, rural land, all of that. And my friend Elizabeth said, well, maybe maybe God wants to be alone with you. And for whatever reason, that really kind of struck my heart. Like, maybe there is certainly something very important about the quiet and learning to cultivate solitude. And I think being with a lot of land around you does require that, and maybe put a greater demand for the ability to have that solitude. Now, one can be in the middle of a roaring city and feel exactly the same way. It doesn't necessarily mean being again in the countryside, but it was just the things that were the factors for why that change felt so stark. Was kind of living in the middle of sort of a bustling college city to like living in the middle of the countryside. But it's funny because now it's like, I don't know, my mind it's like when you really sit with that and not compare, then you recognize the sweetness of the different seasons and how different they are, but how there's this sort of common demand on the human being to sort of like, in a sense, I mean, I don't mean this in a trite way, but really to make the best of that, like you're saying, like whatever generation you're in, to be able to learn how to make the most out of that, and see it as meaningful. And when I dropped the comparison, it was so freeing. And I feel like, wow, it opened my eyes to the incredible like wonder and grandeur of all the nature around me, and watching the seasons and paying attention to things I'd never paid attention to before. And now I wouldn't have it any differently, than to be out to be out in the countryside. So I guess I just wanted to say that from like a personal perspective on it. But yeah, the idea of the grass is always greener on the other side. I thought that was interesting the way you said it. Like maybe there's something, like typically they say like, oh, humans are always thinking the grass is greener on the other side, and this is like, possibly negative. In the sense of comparison, like what I was just saying, but maybe there is a small element of it, like the silver lining of that, or like maybe the thing that's supposed to be good about that is believing there can be something better, right?
Yeah.
So there's that just to acknowledge that. However, it's almost like recognizing that, are we talking about like, what does it mean to be greener? Like, is it a different shade of green? Like, can you see that shade in your own grass and all of that? Like, instead of just constantly looking to like be where it's in the sort of a utopic perfect green, but it's like, well, maybe there's a type of green on your side that means you're in a particular season, and even that too will change, so anyways, yeah, just wanted to speak to all of that. Those were some of the things that came to mind.
Yeah, it's when I to give personal like examples, because I think it's important, is that as someone who grew up in like rural England, which is where people from all over the planet are like I grew up in Oxford, for example, and on the south coast and those sorts of places, right? And people from all over the planet are dying. They pay thousands of dollars to get on planes to go to this place, and all like, especially as a teenager, I was like, God, I hate this place. God, all the buildings are so, like, now looking back at it, you're like, oh, the buildings are so beautiful, and it's all about having afternoon tea, and like people fetishize this place, and I was just dying to get out. And this is so bizarre because I think the grass is always greener has two sides to it. I think you're right. It has the striving side, which is the positive side, that humans could always see how things can be better, but it also has the perverted side, where I could be with these beautiful buildings and in nature, and I literally couldn't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah,
it's perverted, but for whatever reason, in my case, by teenage angst. And so yeah, I was absolutely dying to move away when I was 18. So I moved to a city, right? And very quickly, and especially if you're in somewhere like London, like people are dying to go to London, and as a child, I also really liked trains. But when I found myself working and having to go on a commuter train every day, and the train quickly loses its romantic side, and the double-decker buses that people have on posters in their bedrooms and their offices, that very quickly loses its kind of romantic side when you get on one every day in the rain to go to your office, basically. And yeah, then when you become switch to an urbanite, and I was actually like dying every weekend to go and visit my parents and be back in nature, be back in the countryside. And
Yeah.
it's so strange because now as I've been mainly an urbanite for a while now, for many
Yeah.
years, and when I'm on a crowded bus or train, I feel like I'm alone.
Hmm.
When I'm
Hmm.
in nature, surrounded by plants, contrary to how I felt when I was younger, I feel like I'm surrounded by people.
Hmm. Hmm.
I feel like there's a conversation going around me when I can hear the wind going through the trees, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's so bizarre how like that's not a material difference in the world. That is a human ontological
Mhm.
difference to do with being and experience.
Yeah.
And I think noticing that has also made me appreciate that, when you are an urbanite and you're doing that sort of stuff, you should just appreciate it for what it is,
Mm.
as opposed to thinking that you've been oppressed into being on the commuter train. Maybe. Doesn't make any sense, or am I just being, I don't know.
No, 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 no. That's all very good. Well, I mean, look, like to sort of think like you've been oppressed to be on the commuter train. I mean, sure, there's that. That's
I was,
fair.
I was like, I would be thinking to myself, like, God, I can't believe society has built this around me. It's like, dude, you like decided to go and work in an office in the city, man. It's like, you decided to do this yourself, dude.
No, but that's, I mean, like, no, not many, not like it's wild. That recognition in and of itself is huge, and not everybody will recognize that. Not everybody will do that, right? They'll just sort of um and I understand. I understand there's place for blaming the system and all of that. Don't get me wrong.
Hmm.
I do think there's sometimes things that are I don't say insidious. That's a little bit too strong of a word, but there are things that are disabling about systems, and I think that's unfortunate. But we cannot we cannot ignore the fact that we make decisions as human beings, and we make decisions often because it's like that saying, like you don't know what you don't know, right? Or there's like that song that's like don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone, right? Like you don't realize it till you don't have it, then you're like, oh my gosh, how did I not see it? Like that's how I sort of feel with when it came to the nature. It's like you're saying about feeling almost more accompanied in nature, right, than being in the middle of like just this all of these people, and feeling like that's where it's even more of a stark disillusionment, and the loneliness, right, where it's like, how can this be? I'm here with all these other human beings, but I feel desperately alone. I think mothers in suburbs feel this way a lot too, where they're like, there's all these houses, like I should feel a sense of connectivity and I'm not alone, but yet everyone just sort of is in their cubicle home, and it feels very, very isolating, and people can feel very alone in that. um, but I think that, yeah, I think so. Two things: the just the first part about recognizing we do make our decisions, and so therefore we might want to complain about them, but let's not forget what brought us there in the first place, or what at least what part we had in bringing ourselves there. Yeah, like we didn't create the whole, like, let's say capitalist system or corporate system or whatever, but we might choose to engage with it to a certain degree or not. I was talking on the net yesterday, today, with Daniel and others about like the idea that it's funny because we can critique monopolies, and don't get me wrong, there's problematic things with that, especially when it comes to like regulations and red tapes and licensings, and all of these types of things, which have a place, but they can go so far that it limits people in their creative capacity to create business, etc. But anyways, the point of the matter is, I was saying, like, it's funny because we can critique monopolies, but we all have our own monopolies on certain things. Like we have I've, like, my example was, I may have a monopoly to use a central heating system versus 10 blankets at night to stay warm. Like we have to kind of acknowledge sometimes our own part in creating monopolies that then we critique. So I'll say that. But then the other thing of that you said about, or the other element of the the isolation, and with people versus the nature, like, yeah, I think that always presents, again, the most stark contrast. I'm with people but I feel alone, so there's like, what is going on, right? But I think obviously for if we take some time to think into the questions and the realities of why that might be, it makes even more sense why somebody may feel more acutely. However, maybe just being able to, that's why I've always loved people watching. It's like, I'm actually not here to just have these profound connections with other human beings. Like right now, I'm kind of in images, even with the people. Now, if you get an opportunity to start talking to the person next to you on the train, then you get a little window, right? It's like this little glimpse or glimmer into like the depth of humanity, and how humans are kind of like all these very deep wells that we forget, like the water can be drawn up actually at any moment. But so there's chance for that, but it's sort of like, just sort of take it for what it is. And in some ways it's a miracle, in some ways it's a disaster, but in what way are you going to kind of engage with that? And when it comes to nature feeling like an accompaniment, it was so, to me it almost feels like I was foolish just to not see the beautiful like this, it's sort of like this, yeah, the symphony of creation, and how much it does feel like this incredible, yeah, it's like this ability to not feel alone while you're alone, with things you can't even really talk with, and yet you feel like it's the most robust kind of depth of conversation and communication you could really ever have. But I missed that so much because I never really paid attention. I never really paid attention to, like, how does the wind sound through a tree. And when I was like now, when I was not chitter chattering, not that there's anything wrong with speaking with other human beings, but when I did have when I was put in the position of just listening, I could hear it finally, and I could see it. I could pay attention to, like, oh, I've never actually realized that the moon rises at night, or that, like, where does the pattern of the moon, through its like lunar cycle, or like the way the sun shifts from this space to this space because of like the season change and the axis of the earth, and or the way that plants come up from the ground. Like, this is, I never noticed these sorts of things, but like it's like, wow, there's something so almost grotesque but gorgeous about like the way that these plants kind of fingertips sort of stick up from the ground as if they're like clawing up from the dirt, like in a resurrectory way. So all these sort of like gorgeously beautiful, insane things about nature that are so resonant with us as human beings, it's there. But if we always associate like connection and community in a certain way that always kind of relies on other human beings, not that there's not a place for that, but it's like it has to be in the right way, right? Like, it has to be in the right order, I think, for it to be done well. Otherwise it's kind of a cheap community, and then ultimately it's a potential source of drama, or a lack of a lack of cultivation of one's own self, or their own art, or their own what they're making and what they're bringing to the table. So yeah, that was a lot, but I think that's something really interesting to consider. And one last thing really quick, just a personal story. When I lived the time I lived in a city was when I lived in Spain for half a year, and I remember traveling to Madrid, and I was there with my twin sister and a good friend, and we met this girl named Pilar on the metro, and we're like, this is so cool, we're in Madrid, it's such an incredible place. And she's like, yeah, it's Madrid, because she's like lived there all her life, like it's not cool to her. But that fusion of like us being new and her being like having this be a very familiar place created the magic, because she was like, well, I'll show you some places around that tourists don't often see, because they're overlooked, they're not like touristy places, but they're very cool, they're my favorite places in Madrid, let me show you. So it almost revived her sense of wonder, and like, oh, this is what I love about my city, right? And for us, we could see something that was different and off the beaten path, that wasn't just the hype of the tourists, but it was still something so beautiful and personal, because Pilar loved it and we could see it with her and she could show it to us. So anyways, I just think that's a very cool place of like kind of reviving the honesty about the situation, but also the wonder as well, wherever you are. So
yeah. I remember, like, because London's, I guess maybe more so than American cities because of the car-centric nature of American cities, but it's one of those cities where, especially like the city of Westminster and the city of London themselves, like their population, I mean, at least before the COVID times, right? But the population used to swell by like tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, like every day. And I'm really struggling to remember. I think it's either in Lord of the World by Robert Hugh Benson or Coming Up for Air by Orwell. I read both of those books like around this time, and it had a massive influence on my way of thinking. But they describe this heave of humanity. The Robert Hugh Benson book, Lord of the World's in like a future London, so it's more of a futuristic public transport system. But they describe it as like great lungs that breathe in from this, like the London suburbs, like the counties around London, right? Breathe in this air, this heave of humanity into the lungs, and then in the evening, breathe them back out again.
yeah,
And it's just this wonderful image where, well, wonderful, again, this is what I wanted to get at, is that at the time, I did not view it as a wonderful image. I saw it as this, heave of humanity. You can be on a packed, and in London, they're quite literally tubes that send you underground, right? And you're just packed in with these people, and you just, at least at the time, I just viewed them like animals, they're just automatons. They're not like real people, right? And
Mhm.
it's just like a natural process going on around you. You're completely alone. But there's another side to that where it is kind of beautiful, and it shows the striving of man. It shows the way that we can work together to accomplish just insane things like moving tens of thousands of people into a square mile every single day. And yeah, I think you can kind of, there is that horrible automatic feeling of urban environments that are packed with people. But you can kind of take back a little bit of humanity by doing stuff like people watching, I feel, especially if it's anonymous. And yeah, even if you're poking fun at someone, like if they don't really know, then it's kind of fine, right? I guess maybe that's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of what ethics is what you do when people aren't looking, right? But yeah, I don't know. I think one thing that's related to the kind of random encounter stuff is I really like, some of them don't go so well, but I do like the like kind of prank videos where these people will just go up to people like in Walmart or whatever and just say something really random to them and point a phone at them, because some of them go really well. They're very funny. I think it's kind of taking something back from the inhuman nature, I guess, in the American context, kind of the inhumanity of Walmart and the suburbs and that sort of way of living, right? And I guess, yeah, that's kind of how I feel about that. What does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes total sense to me. That makes total sense to me. Um, I mean, honestly, that's such a beautiful image and a concept of like the lungs and like this breathing in, breathing out, the exhaust and like all of the like. There's so much wordplay. I feel like that would be there, but there's something about like how the exhaust is. We can maybe we also it gets tainted with like the technologies itself. Like it would be dangerous actually to just sort of fume in the exhaust from a car, right? This would be completely dangerous to your health. But the fact of like the human exhaust, the breath that we take and the all of that is like, yeah, there's something like exhausting about it, but there's also something, that means we're alive. Like if we don't have exhaustion going on, like we're not alive. So there's something about this sort of like, this sort of the heartbeat that's at the core of all of this sort of the hustle and the bustle and the movement of all of it. That's quite that's quite beautiful. And like you said, like I think that's why seeing it for just what it is in terms of like almost, I don't know, I almost want to say like it's almost like a performance art happening every day where like you're shuttling all these people here and then they're going all back again, and it's a strange kind of movement that just sort of happens. And maybe we can just sort of at least try to see it from that angle of something that there can be some sort of like redemption or something redemptive in that. It's funny, I always like at the times I would take the metro the most, and public transport was obviously when I was living in Spain, but also when I would visit New York City or like go downtown Philadelphia. And it's also like, again, it changes so much if you're just like coming now and again, and it's kind of like you're having an outing day, and so you associate positive things with it, right? Versus just like your grind or the commute and like how tedious that can become. But it's funny, the times I would feel more about that sense of like, like just why do we do this to ourselves? Like, what have we done as humans to do this? Was actually more in like malls and seeing like the excess of stuff, like just seeing so many like mass produced things. I would often feel a sense of like why are we doing this? And what, and but meantime meanwhile I would feel this sense sometimes when I'd go, I mean, anytime I'd be in the mall, really. And sometimes I have like this comes up in my dreams. It's not like a nightmare. It's not a bad dream, I'd even say, but it's like not a very pleasant thing when I find myself like stuck in a mall overnight or something like this. But the point of the matter is I would go with my grandma, and she loved to window shop. She loved going to Walmart. She loved going to, dollar stores and things like this. But for her, this was a sign, like she was coming out of, now obviously it was different because she lived in South Africa, but and so it's not like, doesn't line up exactly with the Great Depression and all of that, but she certainly came from tight pockets. And so for her, this was a mark of the progress of man, that we could have like dollar stores, and you could get essentially anything you really wanted or needed, you could get for relatively cheap, and you could get the things you need. And for her, this was like great. She loved it. She loved going and shopping, and I loved it. I just loved being with her. It was always like very memorable to be with my grandmother and go shopping with her. but I did feel that sense of like the excess of like, oh, there's all this stuff, and it's, you know, cheaply made, and you know, isn't it a lot of it's going to possibly just end up in a landfill, and all of that. And I think that sometimes I maybe for me, it also like again, I do enjoy wordplay and stuff like that. So it makes me think a lot of like, and obviously this isn't like the Catholic tradition, but it makes me think of like mass production versus mass production, where what's the mass producing in you versus what's being just massively produced, and there's sort of this kind of strange place between like the Eucharistic, but now like the consumption that we have in mass production, but I'm not, I think that it's like, look, there are pros and cons with everything, right? Like you can cheaply get something on Amazon, it arrives in a day or two. I mean, like the reason that exists is because everyone likes that, you know, like for the most part, like that's a great convenience. So if we're that against it, then we would probably, that would be reflected in our buying power, like our dollar, our voting with our dollar, you know? So it's like, I get that there's a place and the purpose for this. But it helped for me to just, in a way, like, I don't know if this is naive, like if this is truly naive or putting the wool over my eyes, but I just like, I learned to just kind of temper that judgment and not be very vocal about it, because that wasn't very helpful anyway. But to just see it through my grandma's eyes, like, wow, she's so happy. Like she so enjoys this. And
Yeah.
for her, this is like a answer to prayer that you're not in poverty, you know? So I don't know, just trying to see it from that perspective helped shift for me to be able to see it in a different light. And then also to just realize, well, I might not be able to change everything about the way the system works on this massive scale in terms of mass production. But I guess I personally could choose to maybe, you know, shop smaller or do this differently. But I can't just always look at it all and be like, you know, it's overwhelming to think about the potential kind of disparity or like kind of things that are being like unfairly used and resources. Like it's almost overwhelming. And I don't think we should just be ignorant to it, but we have to kind of get back to like, well, what is in my control? What can actually control? And that would be like what I do, or how do I shop, or how do I thrift versus shop if I want to be more mindful of these things, or you know, instead of getting like completely bogged down by the weight of the system, right, or the way things, you know, the way things are, and you know, how to change that, just realizing that, well, in a sense, like the history is always continually moving. So if in a way, like we participate in the change by making the changes on a small scale, and it will always it may never seem enough, but at the same time, it can be something to some degree to sort of say, well, let me change my perspective from being so binary. Like that's, you know, that's just wrong to have a dollar store. Well, okay, maybe it is, maybe it's not. Let's kind of temper the judgment a little bit and think about, well, maybe I just won't necessarily myself go to dollar stores, but I'm also not going to be like vocal about them being bad to my grandma, who's like so happy about going to a dollar store. Like just enjoy the time, make a memory with her, be with her in that experience. So um, I'm not sure if that all relates, but I just wanted to kind of think about like this idea of trying to see things from a different, like when do we feel that sort of ick of the system or of like the mass production or all of this, but also try to see it from maybe a different angle, so we don't get so stuck in like, oh my gosh, everything's horrible. Well, okay, maybe it is. Yeah, I don't like the fact that like, you know, there's many things we could get into. However, it's like, well, what can I do about it today? Like I could do something maybe slightly different or maybe very different. But the the shifting of perspective and not getting so stuck is, at least for me, it's helpful. Because otherwise, I don't know what I would buy. Like, because you know, you're always thinking like, is this harming some person in some foreign country? You know what I'm saying? So yeah.
We have a bizarre relationship to quantity and hence prosperity. I think to borrow some language from Evola, to describe this time of prosperity, that kind of, I guess, yeah, starts with consumer culture, right? And starts with the television. To borrow some language from Evola, like we live in the reign of quantity. An example, one that didn't always click, like this didn't click with me, but when it clicked, it's crazy. Like in pretty much in any developed country, in any like apartment or house, you can get essentially as much clean, drinkable, like potable water as you want, pretty much at any temperature you want. And that's just expected and normal. In fact, when that like isn't the case, like the world, it's the end of the world. Like it's things are over. Even though human beings have lived for millennia, this is a very like short time period where we've actually had that. Like the world is not going to end when that doesn't happen. But it is amazing, and it shows you, it demonstrates our weird relationship to quantity. Because when we live in a context, like when you're living in a society, and hence, like philosophically speaking, an ontology where that is expected, like clean, potable water at any temperature you want, it's just whatever, right? It's not interesting. But if you're like in the middle of the desert and you're dying of thirst, like it's like you can't think of anything else.
Yeah.
And this is why, we look at a well that's dug in sub-Saharan Africa, and we're like, that is a miracle. But there are miracles going on all around us. The fact that we can move tens or hundreds of thousands of people into the city of London every day and back again, not just there, but also back.
Yeah.
And they don't all have to be there at exact times. People come. There's like a heuristic of when people arrive at the train station, and all this stuff going on, and like there's miracles going on around us all the time.
Yes.
To relate it to people, like because again, it's like when you're surrounded by people in an urban area, like again, you shrug, then they don't mean anything. But like to give an example is when you're hiking, like in a really remote area, like a really remote forest or a moor or something, and you see someone walking their dog, you always say hello to that person. Why is the context any different? It's so weird. Like imagine if you were as excited to see everyone in a city, you'd be exhausted by the end of the day. So I guess it's there for a reason, right?
I just love this vision of getting on the metro and just like saying like a very enthusiastic hello to every single person on the metro.
I think that would be funny, but it would get old very quick. I think you'd be exhausted. You would be absolutely exhausted. And people would also probably call the police. Like that's another weird thing as well, is that someone who's on a moor and you're the only other person there, you can't see anyone else through the fog, all this sort of stuff, and they like head down, don't look at you, right? Don't say hi to you. Like you think that person is a serial killer. But if someone says hello to you in the city, then you think they're a serial killer.
No, I was gonna say they might think you're like
or a mental patient.
Like you're mental or something like that. If you're saying hello enthusiastically to everyone in the metro, it's like, what's wrong with this person? Yeah, no, that's such a good point. That's such a good point.
But that like, just I don't know, just to like as a personal point, when I realized how much of a miracle it is just the water thing.
Yeah.
Like if I'm ever feeling ungrateful, that's one thing. That's like one of my major things that I always remind myself for gratitude. Because that is like it's so. If everyone's been really thirsty once, right? Just think about how desperate you are for a glass of cold water when you're thirsty, and just realize you can have that anytime you want.
I know, no, and it's like these things matter a lot. Like they are very important. It's like this ability to have like get some perspective on the matter and realize like what a miracle it is. Like I'm so glad you said that, because recently I've been thinking about it. I don't know what did it. I don't know why, but one day I guess I was using Zoom and I just had this realization of like, how is this happening? Like this is so insane and so it was the word miracle that came. I was like, it's a miracle that these human beings are all talking right now. And like I was like, they're in the same frame but they're in different places and they're talking, and it was just this realization of like, that is insane. How is that happening? That is miraculous. What are we like? We have this technology at our disposal at the touch, like at the press of a fingertip, and yet it's so easy to just like be grumbling about like the to-do list or whatever. It's just like it's so easy to just get like completely just like I don't know, maybe it's just the fact that it is so ubiquitous and it is so accessible that it loses like its sense of charm. It like like it loses its sense of potency and like its miraculous nature. But I think we do sometimes just have to stop and realize this is actually kind of insane, and it's a miraculous thing that is occurring that you can actually utilize, and that's actually incredible. That's actually incredible. And I do think it does help to shift the perspective a lot in terms of what we're trying, what we're focusing on. I wanted to ask you a question though, Barnes, about quantity when you're talking about that, because it makes me wonder, like if we have this sort of, did you use the language of like tyranny of quantity? I think you may have used
Julius Evola says the reign of quantity.
reign of quantity. Thank you.
As a rightist thinker, he's trying to rail against the generally egalitarian nature. It's very rightist and elitist angle to come from, basically. But I think it's, whether you kind of have that tendency in yourself or not, he's ultimately kind of right, for better or for worse, right? A leftist will see the same thing and say this is great, right?
Yeah, well, but couldn't the leftists see it as bad too, though, where they say like, look, we're all just like consumers, and we're being like, we're being kind of brainwashed by like
this is the issue: is leftists and rightists are still human beings. The grass is always greener. The leftist has been given everything he wants. He's got the blank slate. He's got all this technology. That was going to liberate the proletariat, and he's like, no, technology has alienated the working class. And then the rightist is like, oh, we just need to return to this time, right? We need to revert to this time. But also, the boomers are the worst. You can't have it both ways, guys. Like,
yeah, it's so human nature. Both sides kind of do that kind of contradictory thing. Not like good contradictory in the Hegelian sense, but just kind of like just contradictory. I mean, we seem to want our cake and to eat it too on both sides of the equation, right?
Yeah.
But I wanted to say with quantity, what this kind of ties into okay, so it kind of ties into my question of, if quantity is the big thing for humans these days, where we've got like all these options and all of this quantity and essentially excess, why then is like the very kind of one of the most essential things about us as human beings is like our own fertility and reproduction. That's gone down. That quantity has gone down. What, like, is there a type of quantity that people are like, I don't think that they have to necessarily be at odds with each other, but there does seem to be that there's like this quantity that usurps the production and the reproduction and the quantity of human beings in the world, where there's a strange relationship where, let's just take the water example, which is so concrete, where people seem to be having, more children in a time where you'd have less access to, guarantee, well, you certainly wouldn't have just on demand any temperature you want water at any time of the day, but people were having more children, bigger families, but now people have
also,
like
it's very important to point out that
yeah,
we live in a time where being a mother is of significantly less risk to the mother themselves than it was in previous times, for those like hygienic reasons. Like, that shouldn't be overlooked. Like, and then, I guess the critique of maybe the modern millennial woman is that, she could list all these reasons for not having a baby, but then previous generations probably had a bigger risk in a way,
Oh, 100%. Oh, 100%. No, I think a lot about that. A lot, just like I think about some of the biblical accounts and how it's like this is, this was like seen as like the one of the, and I understand, like, again, there's pros and cons to everything. There's risk and rewards with everything, but this was like one of the crown rewards for a woman's life is to be fertile, to have children, to have many children. And yet this was at a time when this would have, like you said, been a potential risk to her life, and so, or a greater risk to her life. And today we have like we've that's the wonderful thing about technologies is that we can have more ways in which to help people to benefit their lives and to keep them alive and well and healthy, and that's wonderful. But it's weird, because you would think that would correlate with more women having more children, right? But it's the opposite. It's like, okay, we have less risk. Well, it's like the risk has shifted somewhere. Like the risk now seems to be on, well, what is that going to mean for my identity? What is that going to mean for my career and my future? And I'm not saying those are not relevant concerns or questions to grapple with as a woman, but it's just that it just, I'm always fascinated how things just kind of show, like, do you remember those like masks in the 2000s? You probably don't. This is a very girly thing, like having a sleepover with your some girlfriends and you're doing like spa night, blah blah blah. Anyways, it's like this mask and it has gel in it, and you could push the gel and the gel goes somewhere else. Anyways, it's just supposed to be like a cooling mask on your face. I don't know why this image.
Why am I supposed to remember that? You think I had sleepovers with my girlfriends in the 2000s? I mean, nothing against boys who are like that, but I wasn't that kind of boy.
well, it's just like that though. You know, you push it away and it just shows up somewhere else in a different manner. So
Uh-huh.
risk, you know, there it must. I mean, I don't know. Challenge me if you disagree
Oh,
or like,
next time we hang out, Michelle, we're gonna do face masks. That's what's gonna happen.
yeah, woohoo, fine. I love it. We'll get yeah, it'll be perfect.
I'm glad. I'm glad we're talking about this topic because I think
Yeah.
me and Owen had a good conversation about this. I guess
Mm,
from the male perspective in Schizo FM,
yeah.
and probably from a more jokey perspective. But I've always really, I think your takes are great on this, and unfortunately, they've always been during private conversations. I always, I think, rightly defer to you on this, especially you know to do with motherhood for obvious reasons. Um, but I think I have an explanation as to why the birth rate has gone the direction it has so ubiquitously. Because I was thinking that maybe it was just a Western problem,
Mm,
but there are new stats out, and it is a worldwide problem. And like it's to the extent in a country like South Korea, for example, where I've seen some bizarre like news reports where there's schools that are having admission ceremonies for one student, and there are schools that have zero intake for a whole year. It's
mm,
it's really bizarre,
mm.
and I think my thinking on this has definitely come from an elitist perspective, and don't say elitist in terms of like hierarchy. I mean elitist in terms of what the I guess to borrow some language from earlier, what the heave of humanity generally do.
Mm, mm,
And
mm.
this relates to our conversation on boomers.
Yeah.
When I was younger, I was always very confused by television
Mm, mm,
because I didn't understand why you would let other people tell you what to watch. Because, okay, you have a choice of channels, right?
uh-huh, uh-huh.
Well, I was always like, when the adverts would come on, for example, the commercials, I was like, well, why do people why do people allow themselves to be advertised to in their own homes? And going
Mm,
back to the boomers, yeah, like the orientation of the space of the home is very important. Like, you know, it would be organized around the source of sustenance. The hearth, the fire would be the ancient center of the home, and it would be the source of sustenance and the place for conversation as well.
yeah.
Um, and there's a agency to that
Mm,
agency. I think when people have agency,
mhm,
they're probably more. Basically, my point was I don't think most people have agency. Is my point,
mm,
and television is to entertainment like is autopilot, right?
mm, mhm.
And you reorient the space of the home, the settee, the sofas and the chairs get oriented around this corner with this. I guess back in our days, it would be like the big, the big CRT box with the big back
Yeah, yeah.
that you would, it would just be so heavy. But television is like autopilot, and
Mm,
what makes me think it's not unique to television is that with the internet, and especially in the early days of the internet, you have all this utopianism, like everyone's gonna have their own data, and it's a very freeing platform. And in a way, yes, and it comes back to the elitist point. The vast minority of people have their niches. Like they go out, they have agency, they go out and they have their own niches, and that's amazing. That's that's a liberation. It's very liberatory. But the majority of people regress to the norm of autopilot, and that I think that's proven by the fact that you know, millennials and Gen Z and definitely Gen Alpha they don't have the television. Oh, we're free now, right?
mhm.
But they immediately regress to something like TikTok or Instagram Reels or the YouTube scrolly short thing, I guess is what they call it, right? And that's the same as television. It's an auto playing system. And instead of some guys in a boardroom deciding what the TV schedules would be, it's even more insidious because you've now got a computer algorithm
Mhm.
choosing what your scheduled programming is going to be.
Yeah.
And so that's my point on entertainment and the orientation of space. But to bring it back to the birth rate issue is, and this is probably my rightism and my elitism coming through. But I think that if the cultural and economic incentives were changed, people would start having children again.
In
I
what
think
way?
if it was,
Can you
if it was,
specify?
if they, you know, if the economic benefits were there to get married, for example, or to live as a couple, if the economic benefits were there to have children, if it was, you know, again, once again made cultural status to have a family as opposed to being girl boss or man who sleeps with a lot of women, you know, like I think most people would fall in line. And that's definitely an elitist point, but I think it's true.
Do you think that would be like the ideal way to go about that? Like, I guess what I mean to say, because you know, basically, people can be manipulated one way or the other, right? Like, they can be manipulated into being, you know, again, the Andrew Tate girl or girl boss, or they could be manipulated into being like traditionalists. So, like, is that? I mean, I in some ways, ideally, people.
My point is, I'm not saying like politics is not it's not some godly thing. It's a very earthly thing. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, the vast majority of people, especially in the current climate with the technology we have, basically, with the technology we have, people are going to be manipulated anyway.
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean,
I think you might as well manipulate them to like what I would see as a good end.
well, yeah, right. I mean, the thing is, like, do we want to continue the human species or not? Like, I know that seems like, oh, that seems like you're, you know, that's extreme, or that's like that. It won't necessarily come to
No,
that.
that is a valid, the
Yeah.
technological like place we are and the cultural place we are, and I guess the spiritual place we are. Really, that is a valid philosophical question. And
Yeah.
actually, in the current time, with the like the way that culture and technology and like our like spiritual and metaphysical like reason for existing, like our reason for being, that is the most important philosophical question.
Oh my golly, yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. It's probably why I think on it a lot, and why I think it's like we're all here, right? Like we all exist, you know, as far as we know it. And so it's like, if we're here, the question of like the existence itself and its continuation or propagation. I mean, this is like, these are fundamental questions. And also, you said, like, you know, what did you say? Something about like politics. It's a very earthly thing. Like, in a way, it's I mean, in a sense, it's kind of fair that a government or a society, or, you know, some sort of township would be like, hey, if we would like to keep this going, it does matter to us if people keep having babies or not. Like, it's not like we've kind of made it so like, oh, what people do in, like, you know, in their bedroom is like not related to the rest of the world. No, it's entirely related, because in the sense that, like, it, no, I think it's a very sacred and private thing, but I'm just saying that it has manifestations, it has consequences, it has impacts, just a very direct and kind of like, you know, again, it's maybe it's seems like too basic, and we can't reduce it to this, but
Sorry,
it impacts birth rates, you know.
this is very important on that point, is that that is the one thing that radical feminism got right. Like the private actually is political, whether you like it or not. Like I
But
don't like that. It doesn't make me
yeah.
happy, but it is.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, no, 100%. But then it kind of gets into like, in what way is the private and public related? In what way should they be related? In what way that should they aesthetically be related? Right?
Yeah.
Because the one mode is just to completely invert it, in the sense that now, like, you're, because I and obviously, like, it gets into a much more expanded conversation about like how technologies like relate to sexuality these days, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, we have sort of I think technology, and especially the internet and you know, smartphones or devices, basically like have this strange way of inverting the public and the private spaces. You know, you're in the comfort of your own home in a private space, and yet you're potentially talking to the world, like, where you have access to the world. Like, you would never be able to say goodnight to somebody in your bedroom unless they were in your bedroom too, going to bed, likely, or, you know, and that's such an intimate thing, and yet we can just do it like it's nothing, like it's no, like it doesn't matter, you know, because obviously we don't get the whole context of what the person's actually wearing or not wearing, or what they're doing, you know, so you don't know exactly what it is. But from this strange kind of psychosomatic, I wonder if it does impact us, where we've kind of like put our private in a very strange way into the sort of like public arena, on a psychological level. And so it's that happens. And at the same time, and this comes from like a friend sharing their experience, the public has become very private. So the public, like I said, the private getting infused or getting subverted, I don't know if we want to say subverted, that's too strong of a term, but kind of infiltrated by the public. But then also the public being infiltrated by the private, in the sense that my friend was saying how he was at a bar or like a pub or something and wanting to talk to girls, you know, just like not in a creepy way, just, hi, what's your name, how are you doing, how's your night going? And he said that like the girls were completely like, it was almost like he'd committed a sin to try and talk to them in a public space. And he's like, this, you know, in his mind, he's thinking like, this is a public space. This is what it's for. Like, this is what it's meant to. But people had their little, you know, they had their little private world of their iPhone. And this now had this privacy in this public domain. So there's a huge inversion, I think, of like the public and the private. So we have to kind of get into what it means for, you know, let's say sexuality to be political, because a lot of times people just make it like, it's so overt, like, well, let's just kind of, you know, sexualize everything, or that even sexualizing can actually be a strange, like, inverted kind of disavowal in the psychoanalytic sense, where it's almost like a strange sort of repression, as it talks a lot about sex. So it's just, it can be that too. I'm not saying to just take it at like it's a surface interpretation, but how we go about doing that or understanding that relationship is very, very important. And there is a relationship there, but people, there's a sort of sense of like, well, no, it's just, it doesn't really matter. It's not really impacting anybody. And never mind the fact that it might be impacting one's own engagement with the world, or their own kind of even mental health condition. No, I'm not saying it necessarily impacts it negatively, but like it can. And so it's like, but that does impact the, like, you're part of the world, like you're part of society. And so what people are doing does have that impact. And I'm not saying that has to be some sort of like, that's where I asked you the question about manipulation, because there's always risks with a top-down situation of enforcing certain things, or even there can be risks with incentivizing, though I think I understand why one might want to go that route or consider that route. But it's just that, yeah, I mean, at the same time, it's like, well, societies have their own goals, right? They have like their own, and like if they are like basically giving sanction and protection to citizens, like they may have a, you know, the fact that they may want to keep their citizenship population going and growing is not like unreasonable, even though it might sound like,
it is like literally, it is just blankly power political. That my stance is that I think it's unavoidable. That is going to happen from a power political standpoint anyway. That's a much deeper conversation. I think to like go into my reasons why I think that. But I think this is the insanity of maybe the overthinking of recent times, is that even to go the route and start to question like, oh, was it a good thing that governments or power is influencing people? It's like, well, that's been the fact and the norm throughout all of human history. Like, why would it change now? Why would it be different? I don't know. I think this is the, you know, the current thing, and we think that we're outside of history for some reason. But to like, I don't know, that's a way deeper point. That's a way deeper point. We'd be here for days if we had spoke about that. But to come back to your point, the smartphone is very interesting, because my point about the orientation of space, particularly as it relates to the ontology of the way people see the world, it doesn't stop with the television. Like, it extends into the smartphone. Like, today you can tell the most about people from where their screens are, where they point, and where their cameras are and where their cameras point. Like, to extend that through the generations, like, sure, you have one of the weird things that's happening recently is that people were very focused. Technologists were very focused on making the cameras on the back of the smartphone very powerful. And in the last, I guess, like 10 to 5 years, right? Like, the cameras on the back of the phone have been getting less powerful, and the ones on the front of the phone, so you can see yourself, have been getting much better. And I think it's weird. I think the way space is oriented and way technology is oriented is very interesting. But I do think there's something distinct going on with social media, because I think that at least with the television, again, coming back to what I was saying about commercials and advertisements and stuff, is that the way that media was consumed then was very passive. Like, you're just a passive consumer. And at least, I guess, it's kind of dark in a way, because like all those people in that public space in that bar were probably on their phones tweeting about how rubbish this bar is, right? So they have a weird, perverse active participation in like media. But it's also kind of liberatory, because, you know, like, I don't know if it means that you and me are both obsessed with ourselves, that we've got our cameras pointing at ourselves and we've got cameras like and screens pointing at ourselves, but we're allowed to speak to each other across continents, which is that's liberatory, I think.
Yeah. No, yeah, there's definitely some, yeah, no, there's a liberatory element of it for sure. Like, for example, I mean, I TV used to kind of centralize like our figures of celebrity and things like that. Whereas like today, you know, people have this individuation and sort of fragmentation of who's going to kind of influence them. That's why, you know, you have the term like social media influencers. So in a way, that's kind of liberating, right? Like we're not just stuck on this like iconic person on the TV, right? Or iconic, here's what it means to be famous or successful or whatever. But
Mm.
at the same time, now it's like in this it's you know, it's gone from here in this kind of position of the altar. Like in a religious sense, we could think about that like the TV compared very well with traditional religion in that it was kind of like the altar, it's the icon, it's what everybody kind of gathers before. Um, Now we've got this sort of like, okay, it's here, now it's here. And the Gollum effect is much more likely though with having devices in people's own hands. Like Daniel and I call it the Gollum effect, but you know, it's just sort of that idea of like, it's mine, all mine. And it kind of has this sort of, you think you have all the power, but it has like a lot of power on you in
Yeah.
a clutched way where you're holding it.
Yeah.
And so there's that, but you know, again, like like they say, what like the revolution will not be televised. Like there's something potentially powerful about this sort of you know again I want to say individuation is not the best term, but the sort of like ability to like get the news from your actual news sources, right? They're on your social media pages, they're on like people sharing news word by like kind of like word of mouth, versus just like here's the script of, you know, whatever news station it is, and it doesn't vary very much actually from news station to news station
Yeah.
on the whole, except if it's kind of maybe more local channels. But um so yeah, in some ways it's like this is liberatory, but at the same time, if that itself, this sort of more fragmented, now you've got many types of icons, you have many type of options, you've got more like there's more choice, which can be more anxiety inducing, right? Like there's that book by Barry Schwartz, Paradox of Choice. um, but it also can be manipulated by the algorithm and what it just sort of caters to you. But maybe there's something redemptive, like maybe there's something redemptive in the sense that you get this one image of what it means to be like a, you know, up and coming successful female, and now on the social media you'll get a vast array, right? You'll get like the, you know, you'll get the person who maybe fits more into sort of like the trad wife, but you'll also find the person who's the girl boss, who's, you know, having her own business and running her own stuff and blah blah blah. So like I don't know. I don't know. I guess, I mean, I guess I every now and again try to give it like some maybe benefit of the doubt. Like maybe that's some of the positives to not just having the television. But then I think about like just it's way more addictive. Like, I mean, yes, television can be addictive, but it's almost so passive that it doesn't give you the same sort of like potential high or dopamine that like the device does. The device gives a lot more, you know, dopamine hits because you feel that element of control. I can pick which website I go to, I can pick which, you know, which person I watch or what reels I see, or like I can engage in conversations that then if I get a, you know, get a message back, it makes me feel good, you know what I'm saying? It's more of that, like that active, like you're saying, that engagement where maybe it's like trying to have that agency that like the hearth would have had, but it's like also very sterile and like not actually cultivating much ability. I mean, yes, it can cultivate ability. It depends on what we're using social media and all of that stuff for. But but you know, at the moment like your battery runs out of energy, like, you know, you're just kind of like there. Like it's not as like with the hearth, at least you know how to keep a fire running and like keep your family warm. Like, you know, and now again, if you're using social media for like running a business, maybe you're doing the same. You're paying the bills by, you know, doing your, you know, your e-commerce or whatever it is. So I'm not saying it's not possible, but
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think about like I do think I'm very interested too in how spaces change and how what is actually doing to like our, you know, our like the atmosphere and how we engage in a particular space. And again, like you decentralize it, but then you also have this potential subversive undercurrent of centralization through the algorithm that's happening
Yeah.
on the phone, like with
Yeah.
social media versus the TV. So yeah, anyways, what does that make you
We,
think?
we underestimate, and I'm been starting to write about this a lot, is that the relation between attention, which is I think something that unifies all these things, and again is the way that the orientation of space is expressed through us as like embodied subjects, right? How
Yeah.
intent our attention is again, by virtue of us being embodied subjects, is directly connected to the CNS system, like the central nervous system. It's and maybe this is revealing a bit of my life choices, but I would compare the passive consumption of the boomer in the lazy chair, watching like TV passively, as a cozy opiate, perhaps, and the active consumption of the millennial or the Zoomer, which is all about going to the next hit, right, to get something, or checking the messaging app to see if you've got more notifications, is more like a stimulant, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a great comparison.
But I also I think the reign of quantity thing is interesting for what you were talking about in terms of people having their own identities with this stuff, because in boomer times there, and Gen Y times as well, Gen X times, there were like actual celebrities like Elvis Presley, David Bowie, like these sort of like people who are like inhuman in a way that even the most famous celebrity today, because they all have social media like presences, they're inhuman in a way that they aren't, like almost, like you said, like almost in an iconic sense, in like an archetypal religious sense. And I think this is another consequence of the reign of quantity, because when everyone is a celebrity, like no one is. And it reminds me, like, because I think you and me definitely are on the cusp. We know a world before ubiquitous internet, and we know a world after ubiquitous internet. And I remember, like, I think we had, like most people, like really rubbish like family camcorder. You could obviously like hook it up to the TV, right? And it was always like, you'd like be able to see your video on there, and you were like, I'm on TV, like it's the most amazing thing ever. And then today, like, you're on YouTube and you're getting thousands of views, and you're broadcast anywhere on the planet to anyone who wants to see it. And it's like, yeah, everyone's got one of those these days, right? Like, totally normal, completely normal. It's insane if you think about it. It comes back to the whole like running water thing. It's the same. It's just like, imagine trying to explain to like you in the 90s, where like this situation, even just this one with us now, trying to explain what's going on. And this little kid, like, amazed by the fact that he's got like a cheap camcorder hooked up to the television, the big CRT television. It's crazy.
Oh my gosh, no, that's such a fabulous point. And I'm gonna this is all kind of gearing towards the type of question I want to ask you, but just very quick on the camcorder. Me and my twin sister loved making up plays and commercials, actually, on the camcorder.
It's exactly the same in my house. Same stuff.
And there's this one hilarious time when we were trying to advertise for this miracle cream that we took, like, bacitracin or like Neosporin and covered it over and like made our own little potion of some sort. And Mary-Elise and I were filming this in a park, and we even had our little tripod or whatever it was. And then I just remember this like bee flew onto the scene, and it just became like it went from us like advertising the cream to like this screaming and this like panic and running away sound. But then later we watched it over and over again, like thinking this was the most hilarious thing in the world. So anyways, super. Yeah, I mean, it's funny to even think like, how would I have comprehended what is happening right now back when I was like 8 years old or something, like I don't know that it would even like compute, you know what I mean? Because internet wasn't really a thing. It wasn't big. I mean, no, it wasn't really around. I mean, I didn't have really a phone until like college, so and it wasn't even a smartphone. So it's just strange. And I don't know, because now I think to myself, like, it's so common, it's so kind of normal, that it's funny to think about being like taken aback by that at any point. But realistically, I think hearing about it, I would have been like, I don't know what you're describing. I'm not like, what do you mean? That sounds sci-fi. That sounds like some future.
Yeah, it goes the other way as well, because, and this is why people feel rose-tinted goggles and they feel nostalgia, is because, like, we have this amazing capability today, yes, but again, you're like kind of unsatisfied if your output doesn't have the right aesthetic quality or something like this. And then rewinding to like me and my brother, and like the amazement when we realized we could pause the camera and move something and then start again, and it would look like it was moving by itself. And like, it's obviously like the crappiest thing in the world, but at the time you have like, this is the most amazing thing you've ever discovered. Like, it's incredible.
Yeah. No, it is. Yeah. I mean, but like what does that mean then? Like for, I mean, I don't know. I guess back in that day, there were things we were all taking for granted that would have been new. You know what I'm saying? That like again, like we had running water in our homes like as children. So like we took that for granted. But the new technologies or like these things we could do with camcorders was like, oh, this is so amazing. So I guess it's always happening. Like it's always happening to a certain degree. But I don't know if there's like, does it just mean like having to always kind of keep things in perspective? I mean, that's why I always loved learning about history in the past. And I loved playing like Pioneer Woman with Marilee's, like my twin sister growing up. Like I loved playing games like that because it was like, let's, basically rough it, like turn off the lights, make our own orange juice, to wear bonnets,
Oh, please tell me, yeah, you guys had the bonnets as
Oh, we
well.
had bonnets. No, no, I'm not.
That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. Because my brother had gone on an Amish field trip and he brought back like,
Of course.
So I always thought that was like so cool to like do that and sort of yeah, pretend like you're starting your own fires and stuff like this. So I mean, for me, looking back, it's like almost to do it respect and honor, not to just think of it as oh, backwards, and those people weren't hygienic and those people did this. It's like they were in different times, folks. Like they had different resources at their disposal and not at their disposal, and that's probably why they did a lot of what they did. I'm not saying it's all justified, but there are reasons, as we can't just sort of like completely ignore why things were done the way they were done, or just consider it like, yeah, it's backwards. Some of it may have been backwards, sure, but some of it was like very, very reasonable, very logical at the time.
I think this is where philosophically I can get the most relativistic, because I think to a degree I agree with perspectivalism.
Yeah.
To give a specific example, it's like visiting a childhood home, right? And to give a really specific example, like one of my childhood homes when I was younger, it was like a mansion. It was like the biggest house in the world. Like it was so many different rooms, and we had this massive. I mean, it was still an English oak, but it was, to me as a child, it was a massive English oak with this massive rope swing that went hundreds of meters into the air. And like years and years afterwards, it must have been more than a decade afterwards, I like kind of went back and had a look at the house. And like we were just in, it was a decent house, but we were just in the ground floor flat of this house, and the garden was like a decent size, but not like I was in like a safari park when I was there younger. And the oak was like, it was a good tree, but it wasn't like hundreds of meters tall. But and at the time I was like kind of depressed by this, right? It is kind of depressing in a way, right?
Yeah.
But now thinking about it perspectively, like maybe my parents probably saw it how I saw it decades later for what it was, right? Or what it was to them. But I still think that to that child, it actually is that thing. It actually like experientially is, to come back to the embodied content. It literally is. And that's kind of where I guess metaphysics gets away from materialism completely, almost, because I think it literally is that experience, and it literally is that to that person at that time.
Yeah,
because it is. I honestly think it is, because the most important thing is not the arrangement of atoms that make up the oak tree. It's the experience that you have experiencing the oak tree.
Yeah. What also shows that like to be little is like actually can be understanding, like it's on a bigger scale, like to understand just how little one is in the grand scheme of the world can be either very deflating, right? But it can also be like an incredible source of grandeur and wonder. Like, because when you're little and you look up that big tree, you think it's huge. This is ginormous. It never ends, And so
I on that rope swing, I thought if I fell off, I was going to die.
I'm sure I'm going to die. I mean, because I'm just wondering, phenomenologically, is that just because one is smaller? They're smaller. You're smaller as a child, so then you look at things. But I don't know if it's just that. I don't think it's just that. I don't think it's just that you're shorter or littler. Like it's also just that place of like seeing that as the world in its entirety. So everything has a bigness and a kind of a grandeur, and it's like this. Yeah. I'm this part of this world that is where everything feels bigger, everything feels, you know, more grand, and I'm getting up
Sorry to
into
interrupt.
it.
This is to bring it back to quantity. Like at
Yeah,
that time in my life, I'd probably seen maybe a handful, maybe even that was the only English oak tree I'd seen in my life.
yeah.
Years later, I've seen hundreds of oak trees. And that one
Nice.
becomes less significant. And after that point, you know, I've seen loads of houses, I've seen loads of flats. Like it becomes less
Yeah.
significant in a way, you know?
Well, yeah. Well, I don't know if I'm like, you know, again, like opening Pandora's box to like ask this question right here, but I do wonder if it makes me think a lot about scarcity versus abundance, you know, because I, in a way, is it just the fact that like, is scarcity value? Like, right? I've only seen one oak tree, so it's like extremely incredible and it's amazing. I've seen a lot now, so it's not like necessarily anything like that impressive, right? I mean, I guess for me, like that can be a part of value, I suppose. And again, this is like getting into territory that um is a much bigger conversation. But I there's a part of me that's like, yes, scarcity does um help us understand the value of something, right? Like if you've lost power for 5 days and it's winter, you're like, oh, the when you get it back, you're like, this like, thank God, this is amazing, and I'm so glad for it. You know, you get grateful again. You know, you get humbled by not having it, right? And we could say that not having it is the scarcity, and then having it is like again the abundance. But I wonder if there's also a way in which it's like from the child's perspective, they don't know that they've not seen a lot of oak trees. So maybe there's actually a way to sort of see it as more of like being able to locate the value actually in abundance, where the oak tree is is like the platonic form of tree, or something like that, where it's like a super it's like a super um saturation, if I want to use like Alex Siebert's term. But you know, it's like this sort of sense of it being like it's actually more so that it's abundance. Because I think about like nature, like all of nature. Yes, it has its seasons, and yes, you know, scarcity can be created because there's drought and things like this. Like it's very there's unpredictability and there's predictability in nature. But I just think about like how many seeds are on the head of a flower. You know, so many seeds. There's so much abundance, and so it's like but we, you know, when I look at the flowers, like I was thinking about the daffodils, I'm like, I'm really glad these daffodils to like continue. I'm so glad these daffodils don't choose to stop existing or to stop propagating. Like I love that they keep doing this thing because they're beautiful and I love seeing them. And on the fact that like it fills up with more and more of these daffodils or more and more you know, poppy flowers. Like I've got this wildflower bed and I'm just I'm so thankful and I'm so happy. Like it's wonderful that there's all of it. And it doesn't take away from the fact that it's beautiful just because there's more of them. Does that make sense? So I think I'm just trying to really think about how we could kind of orient ourselves so that we don't just rely on scarcity as our ability to see things as like valuable, sacred, meaningful, but also to recognize that the dialectic between scarcity and abundance is always there, right? Like life is very, you know, life is fragile, but it's also strangely robust in another way. So I don't know. That's kind of, like I said, maybe a big other topic on value, et cetera, et cetera.
It
But
is.
what do you think of?
It's more of like an economic question, like whether you think values derive from
Yeah.
get all Marxists and say, "Oh, it's labor theory of value." I guess I would agree with this like kind of scarcity view, like because like a loaf of bread is only worth as much as a loaf of bread is scarce and needed, right? It's kind of the
Mm-hmm.
coagulate. It's between those two things. It's not really anything to do with much else, right? But
Mm-hmm.
that's more of like an economic question. But and I think that's important because you know we're living creatures and there are practicalities, right? Like it's
Yeah.
important to realize that okay, these flowers might be beautiful, but we're in a whole field of flowers, so like who cares, right? But you can choose to be grateful and you can choose to be in wonder of the
Yeah.
world even if something is common, right?
Yeah.
And to get away from I guess my more elitist like inclinations is like it's a skill to be able to see the beauty in the what's common as opposed to seeing the mass of humanity as just like cattle maybe.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is where I think quantity, in terms of like reproduction, is very unique, and actually, a different type because it's so tied to quality as well. Like because every single child is, at least from the mother perspective, is like this incredible, unique human being that's
Yeah.
their own, one of one. So yeah, anyways, I just think there's something about this. I don't know. I feel like I need to think harder about it. It's something that's always been in the back of my mind, like the relationship between surviving and thriving, etc. But there's something about being able to see how, like, like the one of oneness of everything that then I feel like can be the redemptive element, like you're saying, this element of wonder, where it's not just like humanity is just cattle, because it's like I couldn't think about it that way. Like I think about my own unique children and how unique each of them are. Like, yes, they may all look similar, like they're siblings, but there's such a uniqueness to each individual person that helps to kind of restore that sense of wonder. And I do think like there's this strange, like we live in a strange time where, especially because of the urban spaces, you're kind of surrounded by lots and lots of people, where maybe we lose touch with that, again, the sense of like the wonder, right? Like the wonder, like I'm just thinking about the wordplay there, like the oneness of each human being. And so it's weird, because then maybe people get like, oh, there's too many humans anyway, so let's not have any babies, and I know like that can also be an economic question. People have their concerns about resources, etc. I'm not trying to dismiss that, but it's just that, like, in a way, like we need to kind of get back to tying, seeing how quality and quantity can kind of become, like, to put quality first and then see the quantity come after that, just like nature, right? Where it's like the health and the quality of the plant actually means it can be very, very fertile and make a whole patch of daffodils through the forest. And then to be able to say like, wow, like that wonder, right, where the sun just hits them like that and they're all glowing and you're like, this is gorgeous, so yeah, I don't know. I think it's just I'm interested in that relationship. I do think that it ends up being like more of an economic question, but I think that maybe that idea of being able to have the sense of wonder can maybe even revive whatever demographic or kind of cultural or like logistical geographical place they're in, to be able to say whether I'm seeing majority humans or majority trees, or I'm seeing kids or coworkers, I can still be able to see that, like hopefully be able to have a greater sense of the wonder. I think it's possible. Maybe it's idealistic, but I don't know. It's my kind of hope, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's weird. I don't know. We were meaning to have a conversation for a while, and basically I thought this conversation was going to be about something completely different before, but I'm kind of glad we went in some, I don't know, I feel like we had one of our normal private conversations, but we're just being gracious enough to share it with the world.
Yeah, I think so too. I was thinking that same thing. Kind of like, it's almost like me and Samuel are having breakfast at the booth table, and we're just having a conversation. So
exactly. But anyway, to say a little bit about what we were going to talk about, you and me are both big fans of the Antique Roadshow, right?
Oh yeah.
People who don't know, can you explain what the Antique Roadshow is in your words?
Oh gosh. Well, Antique Roadshow is wonderful programming for television, in my opinion. But I loved watching it as a kid, because it kind of showed that like you could have some old hinges in your house and you could bring them to the Antique Roadshow, and maybe they'd cost like $20,000 or something like that. But I also see that it could potentially like feed being a hoarder, and just like getting your hopes up about your mug being some fancy like designer or heritage mug or something like that, and it's just like, no.
Well, to get the money, you actually have to take it to the Antiques Roadshow. It can't just be gathering dust.
No, you have to actually go to the Antique Roadshow, get it appraised, But I don't know. It was interesting to think about. I liked it most of all for like thinking about the potential in an object, like that it could have this sort of unique story and history, and it could have like, just be part of a greater conversation, not just like a kind of cute object.
This is so you and me, because you're just like glass half full. My take is that the Antiques Roadshow is peak boomer. It is the like perfect demonstration of the problems with boomerhood and the boomers as a generation, right? Do you want to hear my analogy? My glass is definitely empty analogy. Okay, so basically it is kind of a metaphor and a demonstrated metaphor, because boomers love the Antique Roadshow, right? Can't get enough of it. They love it, right? They love that show. It's a metaphor for the fact that boomers have a historical and spiritual inheritance, and also, I guess, an economic inheritance, and I guess a geopolitical inheritance as well. But they only appraise it in terms of its monetary material value, not
Yeah.
not for any of the other like aspects that they inherited. And as a result, they don't hand down any of the other aspects of the generation after them. And as a result, because they only see the material aspect as the important part, they consume the material part, the economic part, and leave nothing to the generations after them. So there's two sides to a coin. I like the sound of yours better. I like having a nice conversation, a wider conversation, whatever you said. It's much nicer than mine.
But it's fair. Your critique is very fair, Samuel. It's funny. I didn't really, sure, when it was a bigger ticket, like the price, they had the price just on the little bar at the bottom that would appear.
Yeah. In
I was
the cursive font that makes it look fancy.
yeah,
The
absolutely.
aesthetics of the Antique Roadshow are beautiful as well. I just think it's amazing. Beautiful in the most disgusting way.
Yeah, exactly. But
Tacky
it
way.
was kind of like, ooh, but now looking back, I'm kind of like, oh, there is something sort of just strange and disturbing, and like and then I'd also think to myself, like, how can that thing like cost that much money? I don't understand. But
Yeah.
it actually is kind of a strange exploration on like where does value get derived from. I mean, it's very, very interesting, because it really ought not to be. Some of those things ought really not to be appraised at such a high value, and yet somebody decides that it is, that, and it's valuable enough to them. But yeah, I mean, honestly, like it would be sweet to me when the people would hear how much it's worth, but then they'd be like, that's great, but it's been in the family for a long time, there's no way I'm going to get rid of this, which, yeah.
That does happen quite a lot on the Antiques
Yeah.
Roadshow.
Yeah, it does. And I think that was always really like, that always stood out to me. Like that was sweet. Like, or they'd say, oh, they'd be baffled by the fact that it could be so expensive if it were auctioned, but they'd be like, oh, me and my sister just used to play Tea Party with this, like they'd share their stories about how they just use this thing in the
Like the
quotidian.
most expensive tea set any like 3-year-olds has played with.
Yeah, and just how they'd laugh and sort of chuckle to themselves, how it almost revealed in that the humorous moment that in a way, like, that was almost the most valuable thing about it, that they spent that time with their sister having tea party, not really the fact that it ended up being appraised for so much, just almost like reinvigorating a sense of like that was the value, actually having the memories with those objects, and the stories with those objects. And I don't know, I wonder if people just do it for the kick of it, like, it's
Oh yeah, you get to be on TV.
what?
You get to be on TV.
Yeah, it gets to be on TV.
Yeah.
You get to say that like this thing's worth a bunch of money. Whatever. But I mean, what's it worth if like it just doesn't, you don't really, what do you use it for exactly? Or like unless you're like an antique collector. I mean, I guess people like they'll have situate their whole entire home around their antiques. So yeah, but it is peculiar. It's peculiar. I never thought too much about the the insidious side or like the darker side of the Antique Roadshow.
No. Guess the real antiques were the friends we made along the way.
That's right, Samuel.